Like and subscribe and click the bell icon to get new video updates.
Josh Frydenberg says Australia has achieved a greater reduction in emissions than New Zealand, Canada and the OECD. Is that correct? The Claim Coalition MPs in normally safe, inner city seats have been under threat this election from independent challengers, with climate change a key line of attack. One of these MPs is Treasurer Josh Frydenberg. When asked on ABC TBS Insiders about why the government would be changing its 2030 emissions targets from those set under former Prime Minister Tony Abbott in 2015, Mr. Frydenberg said Australia needed to do our part. We have now reduced our emissions by 20%, he told host David Spears on Sunday, May 15. In comparison, Canada has seen emissions down by just 1%. New Zealand by just 4%, the OECD average just 7%, he said. Space to play or pause, M to mute, left and right arrows to seek, up and down arrows for volume. Is he correct? RMIT ABC fact check investigates. The verdict Mr. Frydenberg's claim is misleading. The first reason is that the figures the Treasurer has quoted are from different years. Australia is sourced to 2020, New Zealand and Canada to 2019 and the OECD to 2018. This inconsistency is particularly problematic as emissions figures to 2020 include large reductions as a result of the pandemic, and not government policy, while prior years do not. Figures for 2020 are available for New Zealand, Canada and 32 of 38 OECD countries. In line with Mr. Frydenberg's claim, Australia's emissions in 2020 were 19.9% lower than in 2005 when including emissions from land use change and forestry. While New Zealand's 2020 corresponding reduction of 3.1% is close to the 2019 figure of 4% used by Mr. Frydenberg, the same cannot be said of the others. Canada's emissions including land use change and forestry were 9.7% lower in 2020 than 2005, which is almost 10 times greater than the 2019 figure quoted by Mr. Frydenberg. The corresponding reduction for the 32 OECD countries which have reported figures for 2020 is a fall of 20.9% on 2005 levels including land use change and forestry. Though this figure doesn't include 6 OECD countries, it is clear that Australia's reduction is not roughly 3 times the OECD average. A further problem is that Mr. Frydenberg chose 2 measures that show Australia's record in a favourable light, a starting year of 2005, and the inclusion of land use change and forestry. If the starting year is changed to 1990, when the United Nations data begins, and if emissions from land use change and forestry are excluded, which experts have previously told fact-check enables a fairer comparison between countries, the relative positions look very different. On this basis, Australia has increased its emissions by 19.9%, on par with New Zealand but underperforming Canada's 13.1% increase and a far cry from the 32 OECD countries on a reduction of 12.9%. Previous claims. This is not the first time Mr. Frydenberg has made this claim. On April 23, the Treasurer told ABC News Weekend Breakfast, "We've seen our emissions down by 20% on 2005 levels already, which compares to New Zealand at around 4%, Canada at 1% and the OECD average at 7%. Shortly after that interview, Fact Check contacted his office to ask for the source of his claim, but received no response on the record. The coalition has repeatedly made similar claims before the election campaign. A Facebook post from the Liberal Party in November 2021 claimed a reduction of 20% for Australia, 4% for New Zealand, 1% for Canada and 7% for the OECD on 2005 levels. These figures accord with the figures cited in Mr. Frydenberg's claim. However, buried in the fine print is the admission that the figures for these countries are from completely different sources with completely different finishing years. Australia is sourced from the government's National Greenhouse Gas Inventory with a finishing year of 2020. Meanwhile, Canada and New Zealand's data is sourced to 2019, and comes from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. Finally, the OECD average is sourced from the World Resources Institute to 2018, which FactCheck has used as a source in a previous analysis. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development is comprised of 38 countries and is often used as a proxy for developed nations. FactCheck has found two previous, similar, claims made by Prime Minister Scott Morrison on this subject to be misleading. Prime Minister Scott Morrison says Australia has reduced emissions by around 20%, and that this is a better record than the US, NZ, Canada, Japan and many European countries. Is that correct? RMIT ABC Fact Check investigates. Read more. Most problematic in these claims was that there was no data available for 2020 for the countries the Prime Minister was